Good evening, economics students. This should be Economics Lecture 4. So we were talking about monopoly, and we're going to be in Chapter 11 of your book now. So turn to Chapter 11 in your textbook. And this is monopoly and antitrust policy. This is government regulation of monopolies we're talking about. And if you watch the news, you will see probably once a week news about some large merger that's in contemplation. And somewhere in the reporter is going to say, assuming the deal receives the approval of federal regulators, it will mean the biggest telecoms firm in the world, or something like that. Because of our antitrust laws, particularly the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act, as amended over the decades since they were first passed, the federal government, and under its interstate commerce power, keeps an eye on mergers of corporations above a certain size. And we're going to talk about what triggers their interest, what they look at when they're assessing mergers and the like. Okay, so Section 11.1 talks about corporate mergers. And a merger is simply when two corporations combine. That's no great shock. And that's what a merger is. An acquisition is a particular type of merger where a larger corporation purchases a smaller corporation. So a merger can be of two rough equals, in which case they just more or less, by common agreement, work out how they're going to combine. An acquisition can be by agreement. Everybody can be on board with it, and the smaller acquired company can be quite happy to be bought out. Or it can be what's known as a hostile takeover, where the bigger corporation buys the shares of the smaller corporation stock against the leadership of that corporation's will. But if they're available for public sale, anybody can buy them. So if they're willing to pay the right price, you can buy a company that doesn't want to be bought. That's a hostile takeover. That's a particular kind of acquisition where the big company taking over the smaller one doesn't have the consent of the leadership of the smaller company, but they can't stop them because the shares are available for public purchase. But obviously, if you can, in many circumstances, it's better to have agreement. Some years ago, U.S. Airways and American Airlines had a merger of rough equals. And, the company kept the American Airlines name, but the top corporate leadership took over from U.S. Airways, took over the newly merged American Airlines. The headquarters of American Airlines was kept as the national headquarters, and the people moved from Phoenix to come here, and so on. So, but the healthier of those two companies was U.S. Airways, not American at that time. So, each got something from the other in a amicable merger. All right. So this happens, though, all the time. Corporations acquire other companies all the time. Now, the section there is about regulations for approving mergers. And what we're dealing about here is antitrust laws. You might take a look in your book. It's page 247 in my second edition. You got those charts under figure 11.2. And there you'll see the number of mergers submitted to the Federal Trade Commission. That's one of the two groups, Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. Both have to sign off on these mergers. But it points out the sheer numbers involved, and you'll see 1999 and 2000 had very high numbers seeking approval, and then much lower after that. You might say, what in the Sam Hill's going on there? Why so many? And then it drops off. That's largely because of the internet boom. For any of you were born, I know, but the internet really started taking off around 93, 94, 95. And in the late 1990s, everybody and his dog, it seemed like, was founding an internet company. Some of them became very successful eventually, but most of them not so much. And those smaller, less successful firms were gobbled up by the bigger, more successful firms. So in the late 90s, you had the internet bubble burst, as they say, and people began frantically selling off their little companies that hadn't made a success to the bigger ones that had. And I am virtually certain the lion's share of those enormous number of mergers were in the high-tech, in the internet field. And then it drops off. Again, you'll see a steep decline after the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, that decline. When the economy goes bad, firms are trying to save themselves, not acquire other firms, unless those weaker firms have really something they want, and then maybe you can buy them cheaper in hard times. So you notice they didn't disappear, they just became much less prevalent. But anyway, looking at the one beside it in 11.2, that B there is the size of these proposed mergers in 2012. You can see that most of the mergers are for smaller, large corporations. What I mean by that, you see the price we're talking about here. These are companies where the combined value is going to be $100 to $150 million. So we're not talking about, mom and pop dry cleaners on the corner acquiring another dry cleaners across town. You're talking about, firms with hundreds of employees buying other firms with hundreds of employees. And they could go up very large. The far right on that graph is $1 billion plus merger. And there was, you can see, 156 of those proposed in 2012. So very big corporations do this. It definitely happens every week. All right. So the it says at the bottom of page 247, the U.S. government approves most proposed mergers, the substantial majority. In a market-oriented economy, we have a market-oriented economy, firms have the freedom to make their own choices, usually, and it gives you a list of things firms can normally do without getting anybody's approval. They can expand or reduce production. So every factory in America does all the time, right? How much are we going to produce? It's our choice, normally. The price we want to charge for something, normally that's entirely up to the company. Whether to open a new factory or close one that's not being profitable, normally that's entirely up to the company. Whether to hire people or lay them off. And whether to start selling new products or stop selling ones they've been making. So these are things we normally expect no government's going to get involved in. That's just what business does. But there come times when some of the things on that list can be a problem. For example, setting prices. Remember we talked in the last lecture about collusion, and one of the number one ways firms are tempted to collude in an oligopolistic situation where there's a small number of companies is they often want to try to get together in some way and suddenly set a higher price than the market would demand. You can't do that. It's criminal under the Clayton Antitrust Act. So you go to jail if you start doing that kind of stuff and they can prove you did it. So your freedom to set a price, there are limits on that. All right. One of the things that, make sure I didn't skip a page. Okay. One of the things they talk about on the next page, 248, is the 4-firm concentration ratio. And you'll see there how that's done. That chart, table 11.1, they've got a bunch of windshield repair companies in a town. And it shows there 3 of them have a pretty substantial share of the market for replacing windshields. The top 3, 16% of the market for windshields of that one company, 10% for another, 8% for another. And then you have 7 firms with 6% of the market between them. Each have 6% of the market, and then 8 firms with 3% of the market. So those are little firms that, very small portion of the windshield replacement market. But what they do there is they add those ratios up. See, 16 to 10 to 8 to 6, and they equal their 40. And normally the regulators are going to start looking at that ratio. The concentration could be modestly higher, but normally they look at it to see if it's 46. If that number turns out to 46, probably means there are a handful of fairly big, strong competitors. Then they want to take a close look. If that number adds up for a market to 46, it's like a red flag goes off. Hey, there could be problems with too much market concentration and too few firms. Well, let's move on over to page 251, where it talks about new directions in antitrust. So what kind of stuff do antitrust lawyers get worked up about these days? Well, one of them is defining the market. And you might think, well, how tough is that? Think about this. If you're worried about the power that Microsoft Corporation has, you might say, well, they dominate the market. Well, what defines the market? If, for example, it points out right there, is where it's talking about this. For example, Microsoft in the early 2000s had a dominant share of software for the computer operating systems. However, in the total market for all computer software and services, including everything from games to scientific programs, Microsoft had only about a 14% share in 2014. So what is the market we're worried about for Microsoft? Is it operating systems, where they have dominance in personal computing? Or is it all computer software? Is that the market, where they're only 14%? So how we define the market will tell us whether Microsoft is a monopolistic operator or not. Got it? So defining the market can be a challenge. One of the reasons this is a question, especially today, is globalization. Firms now buy stuff from all over the world. If you're a factory in Houston, you might have supplies flying in from 15 different countries. So is it so crucial anymore that we look at just the American suppliers? And remember, that is all our federal government can look at is American suppliers. When they buy a small minority of their products, their parts from American suppliers, then maybe it's not such a big deal that one American supplier is 60% of American companies making that thing. Okay? Globalization may mean some of these antitrust things are less severe than they might have appeared at first blush. Okay, on page 252, they talk about regulating anti-competitive behavior, and there you see the term restrictive practices. These are things companies can do that are monopolistic restrictions on trade, the kind of stuff that gets you whacked by the federal regulators. One of those things, and it has there, is a minimum resale price maintenance agreement. Now, I know you've seen car ads, truck ads, where it'll say MSRP on the ad and to give a figure. That's the manufacturer's suggested retail price. So if it's a GM truck, it has the MSRP, $52,000 or something. But notice that is a manufacturer's suggested resale price. They cannot sell those trucks to the dealers, for the dealers to sell to the general public, and demand a certain price on the sales to the public. You get it? If that retailer wants to sell that truck at just a 2% profit, it has the right to do that. GM cannot come in and say, you must sell this truck for $52,000. We sold it to you for $39,000. You must resell it at $52,000. Nope. All they can do is suggest a retail price. Why? Because if they could demand a retail price, it's going to set an artificially high price for consumers. There are going to be some dealers who want to get the leg up on their competition and drop that price some. So we can't let the manufacturers set a required minimum resale price. Do you understand? It's bad for consumers. Exclusive dealing arrangements can be a problem. Now, it's not a problem for Ford to say, I will only sell these cars to you to resell to the public if you're an exclusively Ford dealer. That's okay because we have lots of competition among the dealerships for different cars. So a lot of them are exclusive. Only Fords here, only Chevys there, and so on. That's okay. But what you can't do is have one retailer become the exclusive dealers for many manufacturers. You can't have Tom Smith Autos up on the freeway being the only dealer for Ford, GM, Chrysler products for that market, for that area, because then they can set the price on buying an American-made car there. So depends on what your exclusive dealing agreement is. Finally, the question of tying sales and bundling. That's also problematic and probably illegal. You can't say, I'll only sell you this product if you'll buy this other product of mine. That screws up the market. It's an attempt to force consumers to buy another product. Bundling is where you tie two things together before you ever sell them and require somebody to buy both at one time. Microsoft got in big trouble with regulators because they were putting in their Internet Browser Explorer as part of the operating system package. You wanted a Microsoft operating system, you had to buy their browser whether you wanted it or not. That kind of tying is also illegal. Okay, we'll continue talking about antitrust in the next lecture. Good night.